Yep. So now we get into what you were saying about ammunition, the state of Ukrainian tanks. I mean, that there is a need to modernize the Ukrainian military and put it on the NATO standard, including the tanks, because, the Ukraine is dependent on NATO for supplies, as they were dependent on Russia for their military supplies before this, and they also lack a large amount, of production facilities to make their own ammo and vehicles. They had some of they started developing it, and it's only until very recently they had it. But those workshops are on the move because obviously the Russians would just bomb them. Without supply, everything they have is finite. It's only very recently they developed some production facilities of their own. But to put it bluntly, before the war and consequently during, they don't have their own arms industry.
I mean, I would be very surprised if they did, because supposing in a scenario where the Russians hadn't blown up their ammunition factories, the energy crisis affects massively production of
Oh yeah.
ammunition.
Well, the Russian. Go on.
Yeah, because you need resources to produce ammunition. I mean,
Mm.
to
Yeah.
put it very, very simply, if I have trouble paying bills to keep my house warm, imagine the factories producing ammunitions. I mean, sure, they get, they get to increase the prices and have more profit, but I'm saying that they're probably hit as well.
Oh yeah. Add to that as well, anything that even looks like a factory, the Russians have bombed. They've also bombed energy plants, which is also a danger because they bombed a nuclear one, or danger close to a nuclear one. So yeah, they are going after infrastructure to cut the nuts off any potential arms industry that the Ukrainians might develop for the war, which gets into the British government actually wanting to put a factory on the Polish border. Because you can already get ammunition and things in from Poland, and the Russians can't attack the factories there. But the British government wants to build another factory and workshop, tank repair and whatnot, on the Polish border, very close to Ukraine.
And who is going to work there?
I imagine it would be the Polish workers.
And will the UK have at least some sort of profit of it, or is it going to be a money sink?
Honestly, there's not really a lot of information that's gotten out about this. I imagine it's just giving money to Poland to build something. But just as well, what we were saying before this, most of the Ukrainian tanks, if not all, were of Soviet era. They completely lacked modern technologies like electronic warfare capability to combat the Russians effectively. They do need a more modern tank. Also, the downside of them being mostly Soviet era, NATO didn't really have a lot of Soviet era tanks, and they don't have a lot of Soviet era ammunition. In fact, the supplies of both are starting to run out. I know places like Lithuania scrapped most of their Soviet era tanks a long time ago. They just didn't keep them, so there's not really a lot of supplies. Not only that, the ammunition is more. The Soviet era ammunition is very difficult to procure. So it was really essential to standardize the Ukrainians on the NATO standard, to give them artillery guns, tanks, basically any vehicle that requires Soviet ammunition, or gun that requires Soviet ammunition, give them the NATO equivalent. That way we can just pour thousands of NATO rounds to them, because we already have that supply, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's
a really big consequence of this. The Ukrainians had, apparently it's something like 1,000 tanks. Although that's a big number. It's potentially they had like 1,000 tanks, and a large chunk of them basically just went to ruin because they lacked the spare parts, because again they were dependent on Russia, but without the spare parts they couldn't maintain them. For example, every time a tank fires its gun, it strains the actual machinery, so it does need to be maintained eventually. So they couldn't really supply them, and it was getting harder and harder to actually give them spare parts. Poland and other countries supplied them with 200 plus T-72s. But just on a side note, a really effective tank to give the Ukrainians would be the Polish PT-21, because it's basically an upgrade of the T-72 for a more modern era, and they'd be able to integrate it straight away because they'd already be trained on it, because it's so similar to the Soviet era tanks. So that would be a good one to give them. But even providing the PT-21s, it's still delaying the inevitable. I'm not sure if this is so much this is going to be a horrible thing to say. I'm not sure this is so much an escalation as it is just a modernizing of the Ukrainian military, if that makes sense. Basically getting them off Soviet era, but again, in terms of arms company and the war economy, look at what's happening. They're no longer dependent on Russia for manufacturing and weapons, so it's no more money in their economy. Now they're going to be dependent on NATO for ammunition. Now, at the minute, it's getting donated, but if Ukraine manages to push Russia out, then I imagine it won't be free anymore.
Well, like I told you, this whole "Let's help Ukraine," I believe, is being seen as more of an investment rather than charity.
Oh, yeah.
So they will at some point they will expect to have a return in profit, one way or another.
Oh, yeah, it's not the first time. When the US invaded Grenada, there's a running joke. Was it about nutmeg, or was it because the US president saw a Russian APC in the Grenada military? You know, I know I shouldn't say that, but that was the running joke on it.
Yeah.